continue.
Fechar os microfones, talvez, né?
Hi, everyone. I'm Patricia Ruggiero, and I'd like to welcome all of you to our symposium named Natural Resources, Science, and Political Processes. We are happy to present our results and thoughts about what links political processes and natural resources, but we are mainly excited to discuss with you this crucial aspect of conservation. We come from different experiences, both in academia and also in policy design and implementation. Renata Pardini have been thinking and studying the interface of science and policy decision-making for a while. Liz Nichols now integrates a career in multilateral environmental policy and diplomacy with her background in conservation. Francisco and I have worked on policy implementation projects. Francisco still does. And we also study conservation policies, outcomes, and effectiveness. So we start suggesting that science alone is not able to solve conservation problems, and that a political agreement around interests and values are a fundamental start point for action. In this negotiation path, we show that there are multiple institutions and organizations in which the interface of science and policy takes place, and where biologists, ecologists, social and conservation scientists must play a role, but also understand that this is a two-way road. Then, evaluating deforestation in Brazil, we show that political will and political motivation can favor conservation, or make the loss of natural resources even worse. Deforestation was dramatically reduced by government policies when leaderships were aligned towards the same conservation goal, and institutions were well coordinated. On the other hand, individual political interests and opportunistic behavior related to politicians searching for votes during elections promote a significant additional forest loss across our biomes. We really hope you like this overfly we offer in our symposium, and that the presentations incite reflections and questions for us to discuss now and along the next days. I kindly remind you to post your questions using the Q&A function, and please to write to whom your question is directed to. Thank you very much for your interest and your time, and please be very welcome in this discussion. We're now going to see the video presentations.
Good afternoon. I am Renata Pardini, and I will present today a recently published paper from our lab entitled COVID-19 Pandemic as a Learning Path for Grounding Conservation Policies in Science. In a period of societal discredit in science, COVID-19 pandemic has brought science to center stage in the media and decision-making. By doing so, the pandemic has opened a window of opportunity for the public, scientists, and policymakers to question and learn about the role and limits of science in democratic societies and what is needed to ground policies in science. These are critical, albeit overlooked topics central to all scientific endeavors. They are, however, especially relevant to mission-oriented fields focused on complex problems that involve conflicts of values and interests as conservation science. In this paper, we explored the pandemic as a path for reflecting and learning on science-society issues and on implementing effective collaborations between scientists and policymakers that are crucial to conservation. By putting science on center stage, the pandemic brought to light diverse processes with both negative and positive consequences concerning the relationship between science, politics, and policy. On the one hand, a positive outcome of the pandemic has been the engagement of scientists in communicating issues related to the disease and in producing relevant information to confront its spread. On the other hand, we have witnessed many examples of political manipulation of science. During the pandemic, such manipulation was constantly exposed in the news, together with counteracting claims, including from many scientists, on the need to just follow science recommendation. However, it has long been accepted by experts in the political sciences that decision-making requires more than scientific knowledge. Decision-making involves the dispute of interests and conflicts of values within societies, requiring political mediation to reach agreement. Thus, claims to just follow science recommendations are unfounded in the realities of decision-making. In fact, expecting science to lead directly to decisions and not taking conflicts of values and interest into account is the ultimate cause of science politicization and politics scientization. Science politicization occurs when science is manipulated for political gain and used as a weapon by opposing science, making science hostage to a political war. In such scenarios, science might actually make controversies worse instead of supporting decision-making. A consequence of politicizing science is politics scientization. As science is manipulated for political gain, political issues related to conflicts of values and interests within societies are taken as scientific questions. By leaning on the false but prevalent idea that science can act as a neutral arbiter, politicians escape from their duties of mediating conflicts. What conditions facilitate science politicization and politics scientization? What can be done to avoid these dangers and effectively ground policies in science? Reflecting on these topics is critical for conservation science and practice for several reasons. First, conservation issues are particularly prone to science politicization and politics scientization. This is because both are more likely when scientific knowledge refers to complex systems as those commonly associated with conservation problems. In complex systems, cause and effect relationships are difficult to identify and forecasts are variable, dependent on several details, as in ecosystem management and climate change. They are also more likely when scientific knowledge refers to multifaceted issues, also common in conservation. In this case, attitudes depend on the perspective through which issues are evaluated. The consequences of genetically modified foods, for instance, vary across agricultural, social, and ecological dimensions. Second, the role and limits of science in decision-making have frequently been overlooked in conservation. A comprehensive review of the literature has shown that conservation scientists have a naive perspective on the causes of the science-practice gap, disregarding the complexity of social-political contexts that make direct use of scientific evidence by policymakers unfeasible. In addition, the evidence-based approach dominates the conservation literature. By focusing on the centrality of scientific information to conservation practice, this approach ignores conflicts of values and interests. Only recently, horizontal collaborations between scientists, policymakers, and other actors have been advocated as crucial to conservation. What then is necessary to ground decision-making in science? A first aspect is to recognize that science is not a neutral arbiter, and there is a need for agreeing on priorities and goals. Science cannot resolve conflicts of values and dispute of interests. Science is also not a privileged actor, especially in terms of values and interests, and it's not value-free. Getting to an agreement across societal sectors with different needs and interests over what is valued and should be prioritized is the role of politics. Science may be called to this political arena to inform, helping to clarify the issues at play. Yet, for scientific analysis to support policymaking, they should be immersed in a broader process that involves reaching a democratic agreement on priorities and goals. A second aspect refers to the quest for inter and transdisciplinarity and thus the need for integrating knowledge and values. Science is not value-free, rather, values are key in science. Science impartiality, for instance, requires that only epistemic values related to empirical adequacy, explanatory power, consistency, and coherence are involved when evaluating theories and hypotheses. However, personal values are involved not only when scientists choose how to disseminate or apply research results, but also when they define the domain of phenomena to study and research strategies to use. Therefore, integrating different disciplines allows considering the variety of a phenomena, partial understanding, and the shared underlying values from multiple scientific fields. However, decision-making requires not only scientific knowledge from multiple disciplines, but also experiential, traditional, or strategic knowledge from all relevant stakeholders. The strategic knowledge of policymakers, for instance, is key for evaluating the viability and effectiveness of a decision. Hence, two aspects are key for effective partnerships between scientists and policymakers: democratic deliberation that articulate values and interests and legitimize the intended goal, and the integration between disciplines and between scientific and non-scientific knowledge to define a strategy to meet this goal. In transdisciplinary processes, science should work as a public good, serving all members, and scientists should strive to expand the range of alternative strategies to achieve the legitimized goal rather than advocating for a particular strategy. A third aspect refers to breaking the vicious cycle maintained by scientific training and scientific policy. In general, scientific policies such as evaluation systems in science focus mainly on the number of published papers in high-impact journals. Engagement in transdisciplinary processes is not stimulated. In addition, scientific training is discipline-oriented, focuses exclusively on scientific specialization, and rarely emphasizes the role and limits of science in society. As the figure illustrates, scientific policies and training creates a feedback loop that maintains science discipline-oriented and disconnected from societies. A proposal to break this vicious cycle contends that scientists engage in two processes: diversifying their interactions beyond their disciplines during daily academic activities and debating scientific policies within their universities. We here argue that COVID-19 pandemic is an opportunity to reflect on the challenges of grounding policies in science. This is of great value for conservation science and practice, as conservation problems concern complex and multifaceted issues, involve conflicts of values and interests, and are thus prone to science politicization and politics scientization. Science policy partnerships should encompass and mediate values and interests and integrate knowledge across disciplines and stakeholders. Failing to address the diversity of perspectives within science and society that there is the potential for science to support decisions and can instead lead to increased controversy. Thank you so much.
I'm Liz Nichols, adjunct faculty at the University of Sao Paulo and an environmental policymaker at the U.S. Department of State. Today, I wanted to offer an applied take on effective science policy partnerships and the role that our higher education systems can play in strengthening them. The bottom line of the next 10 minutes is threefold. First, as much as we would wish, environmental problems will not be solved by research, but instead through partnerships with policymakers and science diplomacy experts. So academics are going to need to know how to interface with those worlds. Second, STEM departments that produce both research and future researchers need to increase policy engagement. Third, to the undergraduate, graduate, and postdoctoral researchers listening today, you are incredibly valuable to conservation both inside and outside the academy in ways that you might not yet know. So, by way of background, like many of you, I have roots in applied ecology. I built a solid research career counting dung beetles in different land uses and then writing articles about how we should encourage those land uses more like the places where we counted more species. I'm sure several of you are familiar with this basic kind of comparative biodiversity research. And along the way, I would hear pieces of this larger landscape of conservation, like the implementation of projects intended to reverse negative trends or domestic legislation and international environmental policy, environmental finance. But in truth, I didn't understand how those pieces fit together or how I, as a researcher, really plugged into that larger system. And as a junior researcher, I was concerned about getting tenure, and so I stayed focused on publishing. And that's a problem because, as we all know, we are faced with a range of complex and synergistic environmental crises, and finding effective solutions to them requires collaboration between policymakers and researchers, and that requires that researchers understand how to collaborate with policymakers, and I didn't. And so I took a leave of absence from my faculty job to serve at the U.S. State Department as a Science, Technology, and Policy Fellow in order to learn. And there I met two other ecologists on similar fellowships, Karen Lips and Meredith Gore, both now at the University of Maryland. And we realized together how remarkably unprepared each of us were for working with policy professionals. So we wrote a paper about it. And that paper concerns what adjustments in how we teach, research, and engage with policy and policymakers are necessary to better prepare future generations to address global problems. That paper makes a few points. The first is that academics can't go it alone. Policymakers can solve environmental problems, that's their purview, but they do need information. Academics can generate that information, but they're not in a position to solve problems. That said, the cultural and structural differences between these two worlds are vast, and we really need strong bridges and clear translators. The snippet of a text exchange on the left is supposed to be funny. It is the response of a U.S. climate negotiator to a piece of an email that I sent her from a Harvard climate scientist. I just use this to illustrate how pretty far apart the language gap can be between these two worlds. Part of this gap stems from the fact that science and policy are produced in really different worlds, and the currencies of career success, communication, and the modalities of work and work culture are really distinct. Bridging those two worlds has been the subject of much extremely helpful discussion and a lot of evolution. Part of that evolution has included moving away from the idea that scientists can improve the uptake of science and policy just by improving the quality or the volume or the targeting of scientific information. That's generally an unhelpful idea. We've moved through, and in some cases beyond, a sort of a second phase, where we thought that perhaps the right solution was to simply expose scientists and policymakers to one another more often and allow ideas to diffuse from one sphere into another. And now we're in a phase, at least in some places, and the US is one of them, where there is an emergent institutional support for the formal exchange of information and people between these two worlds. That institutionalization matters a lot Because one of the key differences between academia and policy that we've identified is that while policymakers understand well the utility and practice of research, the reverse is not true. Most academics in their departments have a relatively limited understanding of what government does or how it works. And in turn, that means that there is a persistent underexposure of students and faculty within the academy to policymakers. So, what to do about this? In the paper, we make some recommendations, and they're focused on how to implement changes in researching, teaching, and recruitment and retention practices that can increase exposure to science policy process as a form of research application and also as a career path. So, some take homes. First, teach the process of policymaking. We posit that a rethinking of program curricula at all levels is necessary to produce the graduates that are capable of occupying critical science policy positions. And this creates a further opportunity to step away from the assumption that only disciplinary specialism and quantitative skills are what are necessary to get graduates jobs. The data bear out that that is just not true. Finally, policymakers are present in every city, state, and country. We should engage with them as guest lecturers, as visiting scholars, and overall, we think that these steps will help reduce the exposure of students to the current double jeopardy of STEM, where universities prepare students for traditional academic careers that only a small fraction will achieve, but simultaneously limit their exposure to the courses and experiences that would actually prepare them to work across science policy realms. Second, involve policymakers in research. This can include learning what applied questions are actually helpful, using participatory research approaches, engaging with knowledge brokers, and pairing this work with the required departmental advocacy to add value to those research projects that may have more value to policymakers than to academia. For things like confirmatory or descriptive work, this is particularly true. And finally, we need to reward scientists when they engage with policymakers. And this may take the form of overhauling departmental recruitment, retention, and promotion metrics, engaging policymakers as department members, and finding ways at the university level to claim credit for public engagement. Ultimately, academic science needs to very critically examine the application and use of scholarly activities in the service of society and the implications of such engagement for institutions, society, and for individual scientists. Third, and a final point, maybe the most important, for the STEM students out there, when you don't know what you don't know, academia might seem like the only path, but there are more opportunities out there than you may know, and you already add more value to them than you may have been taught. So we often oversimplify this idea of a science policy interface to something like this, where academia produces information that's used by policymakers, and academia learns what is useful from that exchange and iterates. One first step in making this diagram more realistic would be to realize that this dynamic plays out across a range of institutions, because lots of different kinds of actors are involved in policymaking. Further, lots more institutions beyond the academy are actually producing information. And so this whole system is really not a simple interface, but is absolutely instead a network. And like with all networks, any kind of work that can help increase the connections between nodes strengthens the entire network. There's a lot of space for you across this network. And producing new research information, well, that's only one, and actually a relatively small part. So if you go into communication or law or administration or research or implementation, there can be a meaningful space within the conservation ecosystem. And if you're wondering out loud, how do the science skills that you've developed in grad school map onto this? Well, the answer is very easily. Some of the things that I see as most important for my current role at the State Department are basic scientific credibility, the ability to deal with 35 tabs open at once, ignorance chutzpah, knowing that you can learn something new from scratch. That is a confidence that is underrepresented in government, and it is a superpower of academics. Maybe the most important thing, though, is that a lot of your value lies elsewhere. It lies in your ability to read situations, to speak diplomatically, to know your place, to have basic manners. There's a lot of skills that are not just scientific. So, in a nutshell, the world has need of all of us, and academic conservation in particular has a societal mandate to engage with that very real world, if you're a card carrying researcher or not. So, while we can think about improvements to the science policy interface in a theoretical light, in a very applied sense, there's just a lot of work remaining for the Academy to do. Thank you very much for your time.
Hi everyone, it's a great pleasure for me to take part of this symposium at ATBC 2021. And today I'm going to present one of the chapters of my PhD thesis that I have completed in 2020. And I'm going to show you that environmental policies to reduce deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon provide co-benefits for natural forest regeneration. Before I start, let me introduce myself. I'm an ecologist working in the Brazilian Amazon for more than 20 years. This picture specifically is from 2015, just a few months before I stepped down from my position at the Ministry of Environment of Brazil, working as Director of Policies to combat deforestation for 4 years. When I left the government, I had so many questions in my head for which I had no time to answer when I was combating deforestation on the ground. So I decided to go for my PhD, trying to assemble some of these pieces and answer some of these questions that I had in order to have a better understanding of the whole process and drivers of deforestation, the combating deforestation, and the consequences also. This graph shows the deforestation rates from 1988 to 2020. And my study is concentrated in this period from 2004 to 2014, when deforestation dropped by 82% due to the implementation of the action plan to combat deforestation that I'm going to introduce in a few slides. But let's go back to 1989 in the next slide. This slide shows a front page of Time magazine with this very important message. Can the rainforest be saved? Can we stop deforestation? Can we stop the Amazon? Can we stop the fires in the Amazon region? And what we saw in the following years, from the late 80s to the early 2000s, is that deforestation rates in the Brazilian Amazon were going up and down like a roller coaster at very high levels. And the models from the early 2000s and their predictions were that deforestation would continue to go up for a long period. There was no sign that deforestation and no hope that deforestation would go down as in the short term. So what was driving people at that moment is that it would be impossible to stop deforestation, at least to reduce deforestation. But in 2003, a new government took office and they decided to take a different path to combat deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon. They created in 2004 an interministerial action plan with 3 main pillars: land use planning, monitoring and control, and fostering sustainable activities. And from 2004 to 2018, there were a combination of actions that some of them are highlighted here that were very important to reduce deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon. And I'm going to assemble a puzzle that is going to consider only 4 pieces of all of these that are presented here. The first one is related to the law enforcement. For their action on the ground to be successful, they needed an early warning system that could provide them on a daily basis information to combat deforestation. So the Brazilian Space Agency developed the Sistema DETER, which is a system that provided this daily information for them. With that, they could go on the ground with information updated from 2 days ago and take action and find offenders in action. And that was very important to reduce deforestation. And these operations involved over 3,000 officers along the year on using helicopters on the ground and going everywhere where deforestation was taking place. And in this period, from 2004 to 2014, over 100,000 fines were given and related to deforestation. The second piece of this puzzle that I want to assemble is the priority municipalities launched in 2008 that represented this arc of deforestation with 36 municipalities that were the priority municipalities responsible for over 50% of deforestation in that year. So the actions were concentrated in these municipalities. And the third piece of the puzzle was the new forest code that was enacted in 2012. In that law, there was an obligation for every rural property to register in this CAR system, providing information on their legal reserve, the area that they converted for use, and everything else that would help us to have a better control of the environmental situation of each property in the country. So far, we have 7 million properties and 540 million hectares registered in the system. And the final puzzle, the final piece of this puzzle was part of answering a question that we raised along implementation of the action plan, that what happened to deforested areas in the Amazon. And what we found is that 6% was converted to agriculture, 63% was converted to pasture, and we found that 23% of all deforested area were identified as secondary vegetation. And that was a very important piece of this puzzle. And from these 1,700 square kilometers of secondary vegetation identified in 2014, almost a quarter of them, 41,000 square kilometers, were identified as persistent secondary vegetation, which means that they were there from 2004 to 2014. And that's when I realized that that would be something very interesting to investigate and to answer this question. What is the influence of the three policies that I've presented, the law enforcement, the priority municipalities, and the environmental registry CAR, on the persistence of secondary vegetation? And in order to answer this question, I have used spatial econometric models to quantify the impact of the three policies that I just presented. In order to do that, I have control for key socioeconomic drivers that well known in the literature that influence deforestation and the persistence of second growth forests. And what we found is that for each fine that was given, it increases 4.5 hectares of persistent secondary vegetation. Second result is that priority municipalities add up to 5,700 hectares of secondary vegetation in priority municipalities. And finally, that for every 1,000 hectares of card registry, it could add 7 hectares, showing that 3 different policies in combination. So, to conclude my presentation, I would like to highlight 2 points that for me are very important. First, there is no silver bullet. The combination of deforestation policies have proved to be effective and co-benefit the persistence of secondary vegetation. The second one is that 2/3 of the Brazilian NDC agreed in Paris to restore 12 million hectares could be achieved by secondary forestry growth. With that, I conclude my presentation. And I always like to conclude and thank you with this image, which is very strong for me, that shows that when we work together, we can achieve better results. Thank you so much for your time.
Hi, I'm Patricia Ruggiero from the School of Economics at the University of São Paulo. I will present our research about political cycles driving deforestation in Brazil. But instead of going right to theory and results, I'll tell you a story. As many of you, I am an ecologist worried about the huge loss of our planet's biodiversity. So after my master, I decided to work on on-the-ground conservation projects. And when I came back to academia for my PhD, I had this big umbrella research question, which I'm still interested in. What works for conservation? So I started studying the effectiveness of conservation policies, which I'm still doing, such as payment for ecosystem services, and gathering data for this investigation. I accessed a very new database at that time that mapped 3 decades of land use changes in Brazil. Then, when I estimated deforestation at the municipal level and plotted annual rates for the whole period, I suspected there was a weird cyclic pattern in the data, possibly related to election years. That first mapping collection had some classification noise, but the suspicion was raised. As English speakers say, I had smelled a rat. Rapidly searching for the words elections and deforestation, this paper caught my attention. Like other studies that investigate the drivers of deforestation, this one also searched for the effect of economic factors and other influences promoting agricultural expansion. But after considering the effect of these variables, there was a still remaining variance in deforestation data that the authors claimed could be explained by elections. A couple of months later, this paper was published, showing that municipalities in the Amazon witnessed an increase in deforestation during municipal elections. This paper really led me to the political economy literature, and I realized that this is a well-studied phenomenon in economics, but not exactly considering natural resources. This is the idea. Elections create conditions for politically motivated decisions because politicians need votes to continue in office. As voters have a decaying memory of past events, decisions with impact on voters have their lowest political weight right after elections and their highest weight right before elections. So popular choices in search of voter support are more common when elections are approaching. A large body of studies show that economic policy instruments are manipulated cyclically to influence the outcomes of elections. This is often referred to as the political business cycle. Up to 2020, besides the Amazon, a study in Indonesia had demonstrated that political cycles affect natural resources. In fact, this one is the seminal study. At this point, I was convinced that as ecologists and conservation scientists, we had ignored a very important driver of deforestation, political motivation. So we dove into our investigation to answer the question, do election years, federal, state, and municipal, witness higher deforestation in the highly threatened and fragmented Brazilian Atlantic forest? More than 2 decades of deforestation data from high-accuracy annual maps of land use were combined with electoral data from the Brazilian National Electoral Office in a longitudinal database. Federal, state, and municipal elections occur in Brazil every 4 years at an interspersed way. Municipal elections occur alone, while federal and state elections are concurrent. Observing deforestation as the percentage of previous forest in the municipality as the dependent variable, our main model compares election years against non-election years. And for a high degree of control, we accounted for state time trends and control variables that may explain deforestation. We ran fixed effect panels regressions that cancel time invariant characteristics of municipalities. We also ran panel quantile regressions, which allow us to detect different rates of changes, different slopes, for each sample subset based on the distribution of the outcome of interest. These graphs are from the quantile regressions. Values in axis X refer to the different quantiles when deforestation rates are ranked. And for each quantile analyzed, a regression coefficient is estimated. We found that deforestation increases during both election years and that the effect of federal state elections is intensified within those municipalities where deforestation is already higher. Again, exploring data, now from elections, I realized that during federal and state elections, transfers of funds between federal and state campaigns are common within parties. So we also conjectured whether the impact of elections is influenced by the alignment between parties at different levels of government. We found that deforestation is significantly higher when there is a political alignment, mainly during the federal and state, but also during municipal elections. So now we know that political deforestation cycles in Brazil exist in the Amazon and in the Atlantic forest. But what about the other biomes? We decided to expand our research to the Brazilian savanna, the Cerrado, and the semi-arid vegetation biome, the Caatinga. Also, our sample is now much more conservative, as it considers only municipalities for which limits are exactly the same over the whole observed period. We also expanded our model to test whether the effect of election years is influenced by years with high prices of soy, beef, or wood, commodities that are related to agricultural expansion in Brazil. New results demonstrate that elections affecting deforestation is a much more widespread and common phenomenon than I could have imagined before. When we test if the effect of election years depend on high prices of commodities, we observe that the impact of municipal elections in the Amazon is influenced by years with high prices of beef. In the Atlantic forest, both soy and wood prices are related to the impact of federal and state elections on deforestation, which also seems to be the case for the Cerrado region. And for the Caatinga, wood prices influence the impact of municipal elections on vegetation loss, while federal and state elections affect deforestation independently of commodities prices variation. But, well, what links elections and deforestation? Some of the possibilities are rent seeking to obtain campaign funds, the increase of credits and permits for sectors such as agriculture, mining, and infrastructure, and also the reduction of surveillance and defund of field efforts by the environmental police. Up to now, we tested whether the number of fines applied for deforestation events by the Brazilian Institute of the Environment and Renewable Resources, IBAMA, which is the main responsible for deforestation control in Brazil, varies as a function of election years. Well, we find that environmental surveillance, in fact, raises during election years, at least in the Atlantic forest and the Cerrado, especially during federal and state election years. So far we know that the links between elections and deforestation are particularly of concern as between federal, state, and municipal elections, there are opportunities for politically motivated forest loss every 2 years in Brazil. We show that political alignment enhances the effect of elections on deforestation, possibly due to a facilitation arrangement between levels of government. We also show that high prices of soy, beef, and wood increase conditions for election cycles, and that reducing surveillance is not the mechanism linking elections and deforestation for most of the country. Finally, environmental legislation, secure land tenure, a robust civil society, and effective rule of law certainly play against both illegal and opportunistic deforestation. In the present moment, Brazil is experiencing the degeneration of its environmental policies and institutions, and in such a context, politically motivated forest loss is certainly being enhanced, not only around elections, but probably in all moments in time. Thank you. Thank you, Renata, Liz, and Chico, and Francisco for the presentation. I'm convinced we are discussing a very important aspect of conservation, and I see Liz has already answered the question here at the question and answer function. And so as we don't have, let's see here. We have a question to Liz from Cindy. Thanks for your interesting presentation. What is your advice for researchers who would like to start engaging with policy?
Thanks, Cindy. There's a lot of different places that you can start. I would say that today in 2021 is a really different landscape than it was even 5 years ago. I would actively make life easy for yourself. Use Twitter, use LinkedIn, use social media to create kind of passive nets that can catch science policy engagement opportunities for you. Join the NPN, the National, that's not it, the National Science Policy Network, and Google. There is a Science Policy Association or network at most institutions that have a graduate school now. Find and attend in this golden age of webinars, talks that are online, webinars, and expand your idea of who is an actor in the science policy interface. The big banks, NGOs, consulting groups, as well as your local, state, and federal government. All of them are offering opportunities for engagement. Some of them are really hard to find. You can't Google me on the State Department's website by choice, right? That would be risky for folks who work in government. So know that sometimes information is hard to find about who is out there, but you can always find information on processes that are out there. Plug in, be tenacious, and then get really good about managing your contacts, and that will snowball into opportunities and people that are good to know.
Thank you, Liz. We have also a question to Francisco. Can you please explain a little bit more how the impacts of CAR, which is the register of properties, fines, and etc., on vegetation were measured?
Yes, thanks for the question. And for those who are not Brazilians and don't know exactly what CAR means, is what I presented is the registry of the environmental registry of properties in Brazil. And I think and it's by the time that I did this research and this work, it was a very recent policy that was enacted in 2012 as I was working till 2014. And what I found by doing these by using these econometric models, I have used the limits of the properties within each municipality in Brazil, in the Amazon region, in a way that I could see how much of that municipalities were registered, and how much of secondary vegetation was present in those municipalities. So the thing is that is not exactly how I measure the amount of secondary vegetation in each property. That's not what I've done. What I've done, I use the amount of car registry within the limits of a municipality, in a way that, because the idea was that as much property as you improve the amount of properties that you register in the system, these people those landowners, they will be watched by the government. So the idea behind that is that if they know that they've been watched, is that with that, they would not go for illegal activities. And that's where you start to have secondary vegetation maybe coming back within the limits. And that's what I showed with car. It's a very small number because car at that time was just starting. And what I can say is that it would be really interesting to check now in 2021 what's going on within the limits of each property, because a final point is that each property, if they're not in compliance with the Brazilian legislations in terms of legal reserve, they have to sign an agreement with the government to restore that area. And it would be a very interesting issue to work with, how these things improved within the limits of each property, the amount of secondary vegetation.
Thank you, Chico. There's another question for both of us, but could you see any relation between the re-election cycles from 2002 to 2012 and some effectiveness of the environmental actions made by this government? And there's also another question for me. Do you think if the general voting population was aware of the politically motivated deforestation for elections, that this trend would shift? If so, how can we shift in power back to the general voting population? I think I'll give some, I'll answer these two questions first, and then I give the word back to you, Francisco. Mm-hmm. What we know from the literature is that these political cycles tend to be reduced, tend to be minimized when voters are aware of and are able to distinguish between competence and between opportunistic behavior. So we don't know exactly what is the case in Brazil, but we have a very young democracy, so we probably are still learning how to vote, and we are still detecting this kind of behavior. So I think that we still need a lot to improve as electorate population. And yes, so I think also that there's a way that we can reduce this kind of impact. And generally speaking, also re-election, when a candidate is running for a re-election, he's in power, so he's in the office, so he has the power, he or she has the power to interfere more at the policies and at the conservation outcomes and forest governments governance in general. So re-election may play a more significant impact than just election. So this is something also showed in the literature. But I don't know a specific, Maida, about these re-election cycles you are referring to. We don't, because in my case, we see what we see is an effect, an average effect, and for the whole period. So we don't analyze each individual election event, but it's a statistic result that we can that we have as evidence. So I don't know, Chico, Francisco, do you have something to add to Maida? Do you see Maida questions?
Yeah, I can see it. Thanks for the question, Maida. What I would like to say is that after 2002 elections, we had the whole starting of this action plan. It was very different. It's something that changed the way, not just Brazil, but everyone started to think of a different way to tackle deforestation. Especially, we have this example in the Brazilian Amazon, in which I have not mentioned during my presentation that as soon as the president took office, the Minister of Environment went to the president and said, hey, we cannot stop deforestation working alone. We need the whole government working together. And the important thing is that the president bought the idea from the Minister of Environment and created the action plan just after the 2002 election, in which which just happened. And so that the story, the graph that I presented show the results. And if you go to 2012, in the middle of this whole action plan in action, we saw that the lowest levels of deforestation that I'm showing, that of course we have some differences in terms of deforestation along the period, but it was very consistent when you have the full government working together and collaborating to reduce deforestation. And that example becomes even more important now when you see that all these things that I presented are out. They stopped the whole policy that was taking place at that time. And it's a very, in terms of experiment, it's very interesting because you saw the policy taking place, working, and then when you remove the policy that is a successful policy, you see the results, they come. And that's what I would like to add to what you just said, Patricia.
Francisco, I'll take the opportunity of your answer and ask to Renata and Liz that thinking of agreeing on values and interests and this kind of political alignment and alignment, in the case of conservation, do you think this should be done at multiple scales? And by scale, I mean different levels of governance, so local, national, and global. And how do we align agreements across these different scales? Renata, can you go first, please?
Thank you, Pachi. It's a complex question, but I'll start and then Liz, please, you can help me. I think it's an interesting question because there's something that Francisco said in his talk that I think it's very important, that there are no silver bullets. And I think that conservation is permeated and with silver bullets. So things are proposed in the north and they should be done everywhere in the world. So this is very, very present in conservation. And I think that this question of levels is, of course, we need to think of all the levels because we are living in a world that is really, really interconnected. connected. And if you think only locally, of course, nothing's gonna happen. But in the face of what we have today, that is much more strong, this idea of spreading all over silver bullets. I think that what we need is to enhance and develop more the participatory processes from the ground. I think this is really, really important. And I know we don't have too much time, but I would like to say that one thing that is happening, and it's very bad in Brazil now, is the dismantling of the social participation in policy. Everything we had constructed from 2000 to 2014 of having people participating through the colegiados and many processes of social participation in policy have been destroyed. So this is one way of integrating party. These policies we had was they have municipalities put together, then you have the states, then you get to a big conference, putting all people together. So this is one way of acting through levels in a large country as Brazil. But we have to have space for participatory democracy. If we have just representative democracy, then this is very difficult to get to policies, governmental policies. So I think this is one point. Like, we need to have innovation. We need to learn how to do things our way. And I think that the work of Chico makes this very clear. Like, what worked was a set of policies, not only one, different strategies put together that were specific to Brazil, to the situation in Brazil. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And I would compliment Renata by saying, first, yes to everything she said. And second, I'd like to expand the question. Conservation issues result and persist within a very complex system. I know we say that, I know we read about that, but we need to act as if it is true. A lot of times we neither act, nor vote, nor understand government, nor conduct our science as if a complex system was the rule and not the exception. We need a whole of society approach to these answers. Participatory democracy is a part of that. Companies are a part of that. Not demonizing corporations as much as you might feel like that's the right answer. Engaging every single element of society and orienting them in the right direction is part of it. It is about, when we speak about the governance elements, it is about multiple layers of government. It's about government acting in an international context. It is about, within government, at each of those layers, having different ministries be able and be incentivized to talk to each other. It is about your finance ministry talking to your environment ministry, talking to the state government, talking to the local NGOs. It is a really complex network that needs to be maintained and sustained in a healthy way over time. That is messy. It is not clean. It is not simple. Reductionist approaches don't help. Simple linear regressions in our work don't help. Silver bullets and careers of academics who are built on silver bullet philosophies and big, sexy words and papers, that doesn't help. It does the reverse. So taking a complex approach is the right one, and it looks messy and it feels messy. And I think often it can be unclear in a relatively metric-driven society and a metric-driven academia, how you can quantify your progress or contribution to a messy and complex system. We might have to let that go and accept that everyone contributing small, additional, marginal, and diffuse actions in alignment with the right direction can't fail. We're crappy at measuring things anyway. We could just let it go. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Renata, Liz, Francisco. I think we are running out of time, and thank for the participation of the audience. Patricia Torres, I'll take your question through our chat, to our symposium chat, and for sure, Francisco will answer it.
You can please continue the discussion on the Whova platform. We're going to end the session right now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.